Hello, and welcome to an essay plan that is going to compare exposure with Storm on the Island. This video will show you how to compare the two poems effectively. There's lots of videos that will do a really good job of analysing each poem in isolation, which is important, but that is only step one. Step two is to compare the two poems, which means to write about their similarities and their differences. That is what the examiner wants. Now, you can compare exposure with whatever poem you want. All of these poems were never meant to be compared, but as it's about the power of nature, I can imagine writing an essay where I compare it to Storm on the Island. So let's get started. So you're in the exam, you've opened your paper, and what is written at the top here is the question, let's imagine you have to write an essay on. How is the power of nature portrayed in exposure and one other poem? So this presentation is now going to go through 4 or 5 sentence starters for paragraphs and then give you evidence from each poem to back them up. So here's sentence starter number 1. The power of nature is portrayed in exposure as a quiet, slow death of personified weather that gradually kills the soldier. This is in contrast to the semantic field of warfare, which violently and suddenly attacks them. So there's a subtle difference that I'm putting in my sentence starter there, everybody, between one that is quiet and personified and kills, the other that is loud and violent and quick and doesn't kill them, but certainly attacks them. So what's my evidence for this? Well, my evidence examiner, my paragraph carries on as follows, that in exposure, we hear the idea of dawn massing in the east. So the idea of a new day literally gathering together all of its arsenal in order to, kill the soldiers. We hear of the idea of fingering flakes of snow. This suggests that they're consciously able to, as it were, brush themselves against the faces of the soldiers. But the key quotation for me that I would use is the idea of the snowflakes pausing, flock and renew. The idea that they stop, gather together and then renew their attack. That is all examples of personification. And where does it all lead to? It leads, I'm sorry to say, to a sense of death. The assonance of brains ache suggest a slow death. Their brains are slowly shutting down, and the assonance really elongates the death, makes it a slow, drawn-out affair. We also hear this idea of the weather killing them by the fact that it is merciless and that the iced east winds knife us. If it is without mercy, if it is kniving them, it suggests a total lack of compassion. I think your paragraph can go on to the idea that the phrase knife us suggests a very sneaky, slightly nasty way of killing someone. There's no particularly good way of killing someone, but the fact that it is kniving them, it suggests it's rather stabbing them without them noticing. It's a horrible, horrible image, but of course that is what the poet Wilfred Owen would have intended. And the idea of the sibilance that runs through the poem, we've just heard some of it already, the merciless iced east winds that knife us. This sibilance is all the way through the poem. We can suggest that because it's sibilance, it's quite quiet, it's quite a background noise. Again, it adds to this idea of it being a silent, drawn-out killer. It's silent because it's quiet, complete opposite of something like plosive alliteration. And the fact that it runs throughout the poem suggests it's a drawn-out, very long exercise that this weather is undertaking. I would then suggest in my paragraph, everybody, that this is in complete contrast to Storm on the Island, which is very violent and very loud. We hear how we are bombarded by the empty air. Space is a salvo. The wind dives and strafes. This is all, first of all, parts of language that is to do with oxymorons. We're bombarded by empty air. Space is a salvo. I think it strafes invisibly. So the first thing to say is that the oxymorons that all of this violent language, all of the oxymorons that these examples of violent language are parts of, are sudden, they're dramatic, they quickly change from one extreme to the other. So that's quite different from the slow, gradual, drawn-out death of exposure. It's also very auditory. What we mean by that is it's very loud. Bombarded is a loud verb reliant on plosive alliteration to make it loud. This is completely in contrast to the language used in exposure. And both poems towards the end, certainly in the penultimate stanza of Exposure, and certainly in the second half of Storm on the Island, contain caesuras. So my paragraph will conclude as follows, everybody, that the caesuras towards the end of both poem are as if the weather is controlling the rhythm of the poem. It can allow the poem to stop and start when it wants. So the weather is, as it were, taking over the narratives of the poems. It is, as it were, taking over the fates of the protagonists. It is, therefore, in Exposure, as it were, choosing when it can stop and start the lives of the soldiers, and perhaps to some extent completely disrupting the existence of the inhabitants of the island who are suffering the storm. I think if you were to write all of that up in your own words, everybody, you'd have a really long, detailed paragraph which would help you get close to some pretty high marks. So that paragraph finished off with the idea of the caesuras disrupting the flow of the poem. And that just reminds me that all of these ideas you can take and pick and choose and put into your own paragraph, because that could certainly work in what I'm about to say here in this second paragraph. Nature is provoking a changeability of emotions that extreme weather can bring, emphasised by the structure of each poem. So this is going to be a nice paragraph that's going to focus on structure, but it drops in some language analysis here, there and everywhere. So what's my evidence for that, examiner? Well, my paragraph will go on by saying that in Exposure, we have a very regular rhyme scheme, which doesn't change throughout the poem. A, B, B, A, C, I think, is the rhyme scheme. But this sense of order and this sense of structure, which you could put into your paragraphs, rather reflects the regimented nature of the soldiers' lives. It's undermined by the half rhymes or the para rhymes that we have going through the poem. We never know what will come next. The sibilance throughout that we've touched upon already creates far more subtle confusion and uncertainty. We hear how they are curious, nervous. We hear that there are sudden successive streaks of the bullets. So this sibilance always comes up when, for the most part, certainly in the first 2 or 3 stanzas, comes up when there is a sense of confusion and a sense of disorientation. And that sibilance will also replicate the sound of the wind. So this idea of a changeability of emotions where we're not quite sure, where we think we know what's happening, we think we're regimented, we think we're ordered, but then the half rhymes and the sibilance when we're talking about being nervous or curious or suddenly disrupted disappoints and rather undermines all of that. We also get that with this curious reference to dawn. Dawn, a new day, a time of new beginnings, a time of promises, but it's inverted into a force that is not going to bring something new and something good for us all, but instead, I'm very sorry to say, is going to bring a new wave of really extreme and unpleasant emotions that they're all going to experience. And I'd suggest that this is slightly similar to Storm on the Island, where the oxymorons that happen towards the end of the poem, certainly in the final half of the poem, perhaps most powerfully in the final line, the idea that there is a huge nothing that we fear. That is, of course, an oxymoron, a huge nothing. Perhaps all of these oxymorons, as I touched upon earlier, they create sudden confusion. They create fear. They create instability, because that is what an oxymoron does, everybody. If you think about it, an oxymoron provides a sudden, quick change from one feeling to another. The idea that you're bombarded by empty air suddenly provides a very quick change of emotion. The violent verbs exploding on bombarded add to this, as does the chaos of the free verse and the enjambment. So this is a paragraph, everybody, which is perhaps not the strongest one in this essay plan, but it's one that tries to focus on structure, and it talks about how there is a changeability of emotion. I think that comes across very strongly in Storm on the Island, and I've made some links, which I hope nobody finds to be too tenuous, with how exposure also gives us a slight subtle change of emotions based on the structure and also some of the language that is used. So that was a paragraph that sort of tried to talk about structure and changeable emotions. Here is a paragraph that is perhaps slightly similar, but we're going to go with it, and it's going to focus more on language. So my sentence starter now is how the power of nature profoundly affects the judgment and critical faculties. That's just a very good way of saying ability to make decisions. There's a mixture of dreary confusion and a mixture of definite or indefinite decision-making, either on their own or with others in both poems. So I'm trying to pack quite a lot into this paragraph. This is another reminder here, everybody, that perhaps there are things here that you can unpick and you can flesh out into two separate paragraphs, but I'm basically trying to put into this one paragraph how in Exposure and Storm on the Island, they're both similar because their ability to make decisions is affected by the power of the weather. So what's my evidence for all of that? Well, in Exposure, I'm going to suggest that the assonance, which we remember is a type of alliteration where we repeat the same vowel, the assonance perhaps in Exposure replicates the effects of hypothermia. Why? Because, as I've said earlier, it elongates things, it drags them out. We hear how our brains ache, wearily, drooping flares, we drowse sun-dozed. All of this suggests that his ability to think clearly is being affected by the hypothermia, the cold of the weather. It's also imprecise, collective and individual decision-making. So it's our brains ache. We turn our backs on drooping flares. We drowse sun-dozed. The fact that all of these decisions and these ability to do things and to try and think and how you move and where you go in the trenches is all done on a collective basis. They are all saying that we do this. Perhaps makes their ability to make decisions less robust. They need to rely on other people. They need to rely on each other to help them get through it. So what a wonderful opportunity for your paragraph to say, however, on the other hand, doesn't this show how they're trying to fight back against the weather by sticking together? And I'm suggesting this ability to make definite decisions is made less secure by those half rhymes that you see certainly towards the beginning of the poem. We also hear of mass graves and we hear of half-known faces, the fact that they can't necessarily precisely and definitely recognise the faces of the people in the burying party. And I suggest this is slightly similar to Storm on the Island, where we hear in the first line how we are prepared. And this sense of collective decision-making, or sense of definite thought and clarity of thought, is carried on all the way through to the final line of the poem, where we hear it as a huge nothing we fear. So a poem that relies less on individual decisions, but more reliant on each other to try and have clear thought and to make decisions. So that definite statement at the beginning of we are prepared is also perhaps undermined by the casualness of the language. Line 4, so as you see. Line 7, you know what I mean. What I'm trying to say here, everybody, is that the ability to think, perhaps, as I reread this paragraph, not so much a desire to make definite decisions, but an ability to have clear-minded thought where you're fully convinced of the conviction of your actions. Both poems perhaps use language in a way that slightly undermines that. And the reason why is because of the way that the weather is affecting their ability to think in a clear-minded way and with certainty. And final paragraph is as follows, everybody. My sentence starter for my fourth and final paragraph would be as follows. The cyclical nature, the idea that both poems go round in circles, suggests humans will never win in their conflict with nature. I think there's loads to say about exposure here. There's less to say for this particular paragraph that I've come up with about storm, but let's go with it anyway. There's a cyclical nature in exposure at the end of practically every stanza, the idea that nothing happens. Whatever they do with their lives, however hard they try to improve their conditions, nothing happens. They always go back to the beginning. No progress is made. And this phrase, this deadened, unemotional language, therefore suggests that they are tempered by their resignation, that this war that they were promised would be over by Christmas 1914 has gone on for 3 more years. And this idea of things going round in circles suggests how these soldiers, very much against their strongest desires, they, or indeed their superiors, just don't learn from the past. We get that towards the end of the poem. We turn back to our dying, which rather suggests we get on with the business of dying. We have no choice but to continue to die, which is very upsetting. I think, though, that this paragraph becomes at its best if we want to talk about the burying party in the final stanza. The burying party, they are, of course, the people who are literally the party of people, the group of people who are going to bury the bodies of those who, I'm sorry to say, have died in the trenches. They are burying them into the earth. They're going back to the earth. They're going back to the elemental parts of the world from where our elements and our atoms and the very matter of our being all emerged and indeed go back to. The ice, the merciless iced east winds and much of the frost that we hear about in this poem delays this process. And so this idea of going back to where you came from, back to the earth, back to the elements, it is somewhat delayed by the power of the weather, and so it ages the people. It keeps them old. We hear of how they have shriveled hands and how the weather is puckering their foreheads crisp, which suggests that they are wrinkled and they are of an older age, or they appear to be of an older age than they actually are. So this, I think, is a really clever sub-bullet point, which I would go for. Just had to pause there at the most dramatic moment. I've dealt with that ringing phone. I think I'll leave that into the final video to provide a bit of humour in what is, of course, a slightly downbeat, downcast poem. But I think that this final, if not a brilliant poem, it's one of my favourite poems in the whole anthology, I should say. It's one of the most intelligent and well-crafted pieces of writing in the whole anthology. Anyway, let me get back to the point I was trying to make, which is the idea that there is this idea of the weather delaying their return back to the earth from whence they came, which is, of course, a biblical phrase that may flesh out further ideas to do with religion in both poems. This idea of the weather delaying their return to the earth from whence they came is therefore, I suggest, quite powerful, in that it shows how they're always going to go back to where they came from, the earth, but the weather is so powerful it is temporarily intervening in this process. I think that's quite a powerful thing to say, and I think the examiner would surely, in my view, respond favourably to that. There is then, that's quite intense material on exposure. I think there's only one kind of thing that I would compare with Storm on the Island with that. The idea, again, to repeat the first line, we are prepared. They've built their houses squat. They have ensured that there are no stacks or stooks that can be lost. So this is clearly people who are very well experienced in terms of dealing with strong storms on their exposed island. They've had it before, they'll have it again, and they're doing their best to deal with it. However, that suggests that the storm will always come back. It is something that they will always have to contend with. I've said again here this idea about this casual language that follows. You know what I mean, as you see, as if he's having a colloquial chat with someone. Perhaps that suggests that he is so used to these reoccurring storms that you could argue on one hand he is not as prepared as he thinks he is, or on the other hand he is so used to it that it is just an everyday part of his existence. So what have I done there, everybody? I've noticed the idea of a cyclical nature, the idea of things going round in circle in exposure. I think there's loads to say about exposure. I like that idea, so I want to compare it with something to do with storm. I haven't found as much, but my examiner surely would still be impressed because I've been able to produce a comparison between two poems. Okay, everybody, so that is, I hope, plans for 4 separate paragraphs, some of which you might gel with, some of which you might not, some of which might provoke or prompt further ideas. 2 final slides. This is the first one. Can I get a whole paragraph out of what's on the board? I personally can't, but there are things to say about the titles that I wonder if you can, and I just felt the need to just drop them in at the end. We know that the title exposure has a slight double meaning. On one hand, it means being exposed to the vicious elements of the weather when they sit in the trenches. But on the other hand, we know, or it is heavily suggested, that Wilfred Owen was quite keen to expose to the public just how awful the war was. He was writing in 1917. They've had the devastating Battle of the Somme. The war has dragged on for 3 years with no end in sight at that point. If there's anything you can do with that and you can compare it to the title of Storm on the Island, please do. The title of Storm on the Island, it is of course quite emphatic, but it's also quite generalised. He is talking from the perspective of somebody from Ireland, and some people will claim that the poem is an extended metaphor for the Troubles, the campaign of bombings and assassinations that occurred in Northern Ireland as well as Ireland. And you may be aware, you will have seen online and in certain study guides, that the word Stormont, which is the Northern Irish Assembly, is spelt out in the first 3 words of the title. So I'm suggesting to everybody that there is a double meaning of the title exposure, and there is a rather subtle allusion, which means sort of a strong hint, towards the Northern Irish Assembly, and therefore perhaps one may argue the politics and the government of Northern Ireland, which has a very troubled past. If you can compare those two and suggest how they may work for this examination question on the power of nature, you would be doing really well, and you've got another fantastic paragraph to work on. And the final slide, everybody, is what I would suggest is a pretty good introduction, which touches on the nature of the 2 titles, which I'm going to leave up on the board. Could I write all of this under time conditions, this long, meaty introduction? Well, just about, but it took me a while to write this, so please don't worry if you can't do an introduction like this. But as I always get asked, what should I put in the introduction? Hopefully, what is on the screen now is a good example of something like that, which if you were to get quite close to, or indeed do better than, of course, you will be doing really well. Okay, everybody, well done. Bye for now.